So thank you so much for doing this. We
Yes,
are
thank you.
welcoming Dantiel W. Moniz to our little show here, and we're going to talk about her book, Milk, Blood. Oops, almost dropped it. Heat. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Yeah. Feel like, yeah, it's been a long and short summer, if that makes any sense. But
It
yeah.
does. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. Have you been home for the summer? Have you been traveling?
Yeah,
What's
all of the above. Yeah. Traveling. I was in like in a span of like 1 month, I was in Seattle, I went to Rome, I went to Austin, I went to
wow.
Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Yeah, it was a busy summer, but
Uh, You came out of quarantine and you were like, I'm going everywhere.
it's like it's time, yeah, to go do some stuff. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Was there any like favorite spots on your travels?
Yeah, so many. I mean, I had never been to Europe before, so going to Rome was its own thing. Got some research there with some colleagues and friends that, hopefully will turn into some creative projects.
Oh,
So,
wow, that's
and
cool.
I had never been to Gatlinburg, Tennessee either. So, did some hikes in the Smoky Mountains, which was really cool.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Um, I have to admit I've been sort of nervous to do this interview because I was so blown away by the book. I was like it kind of took my breath away when I read it the first time. And I feel like I have so many things I want to ask you about and so many lines that I love and quotes and I think that I was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know where to start." And I feel like I'm just going to end up in a jumbled mess. So, I'm sorry if my like fanness in this situation
No,
makes this
that's
the way off.
amazing. Like, I wrote the book and have been talking about the book, like, since it came out, and every time I get ready to do a conversation, I'm like, "Do I know anything? Can I say anything?" Like
You definitely know a lot. I can confidently tell you that from reading your book. So, yeah, I read the book the first time when I was in Atlanta working on a project, which was super interesting because it was really hot. And so even though I wasn't in Florida, I felt
Yeah,
like I was in the right sort of like humid
yeah.
environment to be able to really soak up the world that you laid out in Florida. Um, and I don't know, it was interesting because I know I've watched a lot of your interviews and I know you've talked a lot about the different themes that are in the book, and we'll touch on all that too. We tend to kind of dig a little bit into process and sort of
Okay.
what where inspiration kind of comes from. But but I also was just really taken by how specific everything is, which made it so universally relatable. Like
Mm.
the characters are so rich and they're so specific, and I feel like I can see the movie in my head for every single short story. And yet at the same time, I felt like every story kept finding myself in it in some way, which I don't feel is always the case, especially I think with short stories, because sometimes it's such a finite amount of time to capture someone in that world, and um, just even that for the first story in the collection, Milk, Blood, Heat, with the two girls with Anna and Kira. I felt like, "Oh my gosh, I remember those kind of connections where you feel like you have an unspoken understanding with a friend at that age, where you think you know the world that you're in with them and they feel so seen, and yet to get to that moment where Kira jumps and she's like, that's not the agreement that we had. I thought this was a conversation. I didn't think this was, and so there was something just so breathtaking about being able to be with characters like that. Did you feel like that some of those characters were people that had been kind of living inside you for a long time? Do you keep little notes of things you notice? Do you have a psychology background? I know that's a lot of questions all in one, but I was like, how can one person understand this many people with so much depth? Is there a process for you that gets you to that place with characters?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring up the psychology thing. I actually minored in psychology in undergraduate. I thought like, yeah, I'm so interested in like how we are, like why we are the way that we are and how we move through people. Like always, always, always. Like I keep journals still. But when I was 8, there's this journal that I have where I'm like, I wonder why I was born like a human instead of like a tiger. You know what I mean? So like I've always been thinking that way, but um I think for me, yeah, I'm really curious is the nice way to say the thing about me. My mom would always be like, "Yeah, you're
Right.
always asking questions. You're always like, why? But why? But why?" And I, you wouldn't be satisfied until I actually like sat and like explained something to you. So I think for me, I'm always observant. I'm always like really in connection with what's going on around me, especially as concerns people. Like that, another way to say it is like I'm nosy, but like in a way where I'm like deeply curious about what's going on. So for me, I definitely keep notes in my phone. Like I never pretty much have like a paper or like pen. I always have a
Mm.
pen, but like no paper, but like I always have my phone. So I'll just like jot down things that I overhear or things that I see that I'm like, oh, I'm just curious about that, or that image is striking to me. And then it's funny because people say that about my characters all the time, that they feel like people, that they feel really lived in, but like the characters don't usually come first for me. It's like an idea maybe, or a conversation, even though I don't know who the people are who are speaking to each other. And then after I'm
Mm.
trying to decide like, well, how could I take this little fragment of this thing that I've witnessed and make a world out of it to explore the things that I'm curious about? Then the people kind of, I'm like, oh, okay, this makes sense for these people, kind of.
Wow, that's so fascinating that it's really, yeah, I don't know, maybe it just speaks to the texture of your imagination and the way that you're able to build all of that because it feels so vivid and so real.
Yeah.
Um, what kind of got you to a place of realizing that these stories lived together, or at what point in the process? I know one of your stories you started. I think I read somewhere that one of your stories you started like in 2014 or something, and then that kind of evolved from there. But if you could give our audience a little sense of
Yeah.
just the journey from the first story to realizing that this was actually a collection of stories that lived so beautifully together.
Yeah, so I realized very recently, because I've been looking at old journals from like I don't know, like 2007, 2008, this kind of era. I have been saying in all these interviews for like over a year now that like I didn't know these were going to be short stories, and and then I'm looking at something I wrote in 2009 that's like I'm going to make a short story collection and it's going to be this. I was like,
You just forgot.
I forgot, I guess, that I did it, but still, it's true that even though I had those ambitions like well before, and I had forgotten that I had those ambitions, I feel like I did not know that these were a story collection when I was working on them. So the first
Yeah.
one is Outside the Raft, which was I did in undergrad in 2012. And that was just a story from a prompt, like an assignment that we had. And it didn't
Wow.
look like this, obviously. It was not this
Sure, of
story, but
course.
all
Yeah.
the little seeds were there. But I had it wasn't until I got to my MFA. So I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I now teach. But I had that story. That's what I used to get into the program. And then I was supposed to be writing, but I had like deep imposter syndrome. And all the stories that I had written, I was like, they're like the same story, but like with just different characters. You're just changing characters' names. You just keep writing the same story. And then I had a
Mm.
friend who was like, it's not the same story, but maybe it's the same questions. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I guess that's why can't short stories do that? Why wouldn't a short story collection, if I'm meaning for these stories to hang together, then like why wouldn't it be like an exploration of the same kind of ideas or questions, but like turned on their head slightly or turned at different angles to catch a different facet? You know what I mean? So
Yeah, 100%. And I
yeah.
mean, I felt that as a reader. I have now read it twice since the first reading of it, but I part of the reason I picked this up first when we were approaching our first section of books that we were going to feature on A3C Reads, because I was like, okay, I'm working on a project. This is a short story. I'm going to be able to, these are a collection of short stories. I'm going to be able to, read 10, 15, 20 pages and like go and do what I need to do and come back. I couldn't put it down. I just, it was so, it really catapults you forward from story to story because the way those questions snowball on each other, I felt like, oh, now that I'm in with these people, I want to know the next thing, And I felt like not to make this just about like how much I love your writing. I'm sorry to be geeking out a little bit, but I just felt like I just had never read anything. I felt seen. Like I literally felt seen by what you had written in a way that I know it wasn't like written specifically for me, obviously, but there were just so many ideas and questions that you were asking. You bring up early on, I'll just read a little quote. You say, before 13, she hadn't realized empty was a thing you could carry, but who put it there? Sometimes she wonders if she will ever be rid of it, and other times she never wants to give it back. It's a thing she owns. Yeah, it's page 4. It's just like, and you circle back to it, like in 90 on 92, it's in a totally different way as the stories have evolved, and you say, sorry, let me find it, 90. I tried to mark these as best I could to be able to do this quickly, but
You're doing amazing. This is great.
she said she's eaten, but she feels an emptiness she won't learn to recognize until later as the expansion of herself, a good sign, but easy to mistake. So, in 92, well, 88 pages, you've gone from what is empty and is it this sort of scary, precarious thing that we have to be burdened with in some way? Or is it actually a sign of something good? Like it's, so, and these are two very different stories, but it's really satisfying as the person consuming it to be taken on this journey. Did you have a sense as you were putting the stories together that they were going to kind of fall out that way, or was it more just intuition?
Sorry, I'm gonna turn off my air conditioner really quick.
Sure.
It just came on and it's like hot. Sorry.
No worries.
My bad. Sorry, audience. Yeah, I think at first I was doing all of these things unconsciously. Just the
Mhm.
way that my process works. My brain was making all these connections. And then it wasn't until, I had that conversation with a friend that was like, maybe it's the same questions and it's not the same story. That then I went back and I read all of the stories that I then had, maybe like 4 or 5 stories, and was looking at all. I'm like, oh, okay, I can see like I'm using the same kind of word here, or the image
Mm,
here, or this kind of thing. And then I was able to go back and do that consciously as I was like, okay, this is a collection. I kind of know what I'm heading toward now. But yeah, it was really interesting to see like different, like I said, words being repeated. And I call them like totems. It's like every
mm.
time you see that word again or that image again, I'm hoping that it has evolved or gained resonance, so that it's striking you at a slightly different measure each time to build up to a full effect by the time you get to the last story in the collection.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely had that experience while reading it. I I again, racing with questions. I'm like, where do I wish we could do an hour interview about every single story. So I was like, I've got to trim this back. I also feel like there's sort of this your writing feels like music to me, and maybe that's because I come from a family of musicians. Do you have music in your background? Was that something that's intentional, or is that just sort of the cadence that comes to you naturally?
It's interesting you say music too, because I do think sound is super important to me in terms of formulating a sentence. I'm very much like a sentences person. I'm like, the sentences have to feel right. They have to,
Yep.
and what they sound like means as much to me as what they mean. And yeah, I'm always thinking about rhythm. Like, when I read it in my internal voice, like, how does it sound on the page? And somehow, I don't know how it sounds in other people's internal voices. You know what I mean? But I'm assuming
Sure.
something there striking. So maybe if it isn't music exactly, it is definitely sound, rhythm, like tempo, like that kind of thing I'm really attuned to.
And was that like, did you have a lot of music in your house growing up? Was it, what was your home life like in terms of just the
Yeah.
sensory things that were around you as you were growing up?
Yeah, so one of the things that happened this year was that and this is not like we're not trying to get like sad story type stuff, but my mother actually did pass in April
Oh,
this year. And I've been like, dealing with a lot of that stuff, especially because this collection deals with mothers and motherhood
so
so
much.
much. And
Yeah.
that was like the secret thing I didn't know that I was writing while I was writing these other things. But I'm also writing on another thing that has to deal with like mothers and daughters. So it's been really interesting to have my mom pass and be thinking about like, oh,
Mm.
what was the environment that shaped me? But I'm also thinking I used to write. I used to be in chorus like in like elementary school and middle school, and I would do like solo ensemble and all these like competitions and things like that. But I was thinking about it and I was like, oh, my mom used to be like in a girl group. Like she used to have her friends over and they would like,
No
like kind of
way.
stylize and that kind of thing. And I was thinking like, oh, I forgot about that. And maybe I want to like get more connected into that stuff. So maybe not like formal music training or any kind of thing like that. But yeah, my mom was always really into music. She was always singing. I used to be singing, and it's just things that I forgot about until this year when I'm like going back in my mind about all of that stuff. So
Oh,
be
wow.
yeah,
I'm sorry you're going through all that. It really is such a, present theme in the stories of motherhood and the complicated feelings of motherhood, which I also think is super rare to see written. I feel like people kind of shy away from that. Maybe not as much lately, but when I speak to my friends who are mothers, um, this made me think you must be a mother, but I don't think you are. Do you have
not
children? No.
mm-mm.
I mean, I don't know how. I don't have kids yet. I do want to have kids, but looking at some of these passages, I think I have one of them marked actually, where you talk about, what when she remembers what she was before the child. I don't know. I might not have it marked properly. Um, I don't think I have it marked properly, but I felt like I've had that conversation with every one of my friends who's a mother, just different versions of it, but it was just so palpable. Do you feel like that's just conversation that you were able to have with your mother, or that was just the intuition you were having of observing her experience or other mothers'
Yeah.
experiences?
Definitely not a conversation I had with my mom. My mom and I actually had like kind of a turbulent relationship in my teens.
Mm,
It's like that first moment where you realize like, oh, your mother isn't right about everything. You know what I
yeah.
mean? And then you have different opinions and then how that strikes. But I did at some point when I was either, I don't know, maybe 21, 22, something like that. I looked at her and I had this moment where I was like, "Oh, she also it's her first time on the earth and she's doing the best that she can, and it might not always be the love that I need or want, but like she does love me and she's trying." And
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And seeing her that way, like as a human and not just my mom, who I'm like, why can't you just understand me? I'm like, oh, you're dealing with your own traumas and childhood and upbringing and all your stuff the best way that you can with the tools that you've had. And so it allowed me to like put boundaries in place where I needed boundaries, but also like to love her better and to be like, hey, it is what it is. And so, yeah, it wasn't a conversation we ever had, but it was a thing that I came to somehow over the course of just being in relation to her. So,
It makes me feel like I believe in past lives or something, because it's so visceral, your explanations and your descriptions of the experiences of motherhood, or even, when the
yeah.
characters, um, what's the story where she loses, is it
Necessary.
Feast, where she loses the
Oh, yeah,
baby?
feast. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just such, there's so many stories that touch on it. I was also really struck by, and I know you've talked about this quite a bit, but just how driven the stories are by duality, and how interested you are in it in a way that um really made sense to me in terms of how I approach my work too. So it's like when I'm looking at something, when I'm looking at a character that I'm playing, or if I'm looking at a project that I'm directing, I'm always very aware that there is no light without dark, and there's no dark without light, and you don't have a full person unless you've got all of that. Even when I was on Once Upon a Time, it was interesting to see like the fans' reactions when they had the character go dark for a while. Some people really embraced and understood that that made someone more whole, and then some people were like, I can't, that she has to only be good.
You're like,
So it was,
"No, no, we don't
yeah,
get it."
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just, I'm very aware of that theme, and I'm just curious to know like where that sort of like kind of got in there for you in terms of that driving so much of your storytelling, because clearly we're living in a world that is very divided right now, and we have so many issues that are so polarizing. And there's something interesting about the timing of this collection coming into the world, where even though it would be a metaphorical representation of that, because it's family and it's relationships and it's intimate compared to like global, it does feel like it kind of ties into that global issue that's going on in the world. Is that something you were thinking about, or was this just something that was kind of driving the stories and then it made sense to pull them together?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about it on just the micro level of I always have kind of this question in my head of like, am I a good person? This is the thing that
Mm,
I say all the time, and really because, and I'm working on it. I tend to skew to the negative when I'm thinking about things in myself. I think that's just like conditioning in certain ways. That's all these different things, but it's really the question is, am I a bad person? And so it's
mm,
how do you know what goodness is if you also don't know what badness is, if you have no frame of reference? And I also think it's really interesting you're saying about your audience's reaction to like a character going dark, right? And it's just like some the need to like pull back and be like, no, or to resist it, right? And I think that
Yeah.
that is so telling with how we have been conditioned in general, especially in Western culture, to be where you have to feel shame or guilt or wrongness about certain aspects that are totally human and everybody feels, but like it's hard to admit to when you're told that you're not supposed to be a certain way. And so then instead of dealing with those things in a really healthy way, we often are dealing with them in ways that harm ourselves and the people around us, and then
Mm.
apply that to the macro, the large scale of like we're just replicating that, not being able to deal with our own feelings because we feel shame or guilt or anger about them, and then harming ourselves and others on a large scale.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's you're able to tangibly show that in so many of your stories. I mean, even when, I don't remember which story it is where she's at the aquarium and she sees
That's
the
deep too.
octopus sort of like, hurting itself. And, which story was that?
That's feast.
That's Feast, that's right,
Mhm.
okay. And, it just clearly that's a really hard image to wrap your brain around because but it's such a visual way of representing what you're talking all of what you're talking about,
Yeah.
in terms of the way that things come out sideways and how extreme they can come out if we don't deal with them. And but then also how they have to be sort of fully digested and worked through and if we don't face them, sweeping them under the rug is just as bad as not doing it. So yeah, that's all super interesting and leads me to another part of the duality that I was super fascinated by, which is that, like, I kind of feel like traditionally violence has been reserved for like male stories in
Mhm.
some way. And there was something so relieving as a woman reading the stories to go, oh, there is violence in my body. It's violence that no one talks about. It's blood that no one talks about, but it's part of my existence as like a creature on this planet, and there was
Yeah.
something so interesting because I had never thought about it that way before until reading these stories. And how did you find that balance? Because there's such a beautiful through line of hope. Like it feels so life affirming, all of the
Thank you.
stories.
Thank you. Because
It
people will
does.
be like, "Oh my god, these stories are so dark." And I'm like, "Yeah, but they're not just dark." You know what I mean? It's
I didn't read it that way. Maybe that's the lens that I see the world, but
yeah.
I read it as really very, very life affirming, but it felt like I was given permission by you as the writer to acknowledge parts of myself I didn't even know I wasn't acknowledging, like that I was unaware of having set aside or kind of divorced myself from. And there was something so relieving about being made whole by thinking of all those things. Were there moments for you in your own life that kind of triggered that wholeness, or is that just something that was like in you?
I mean, I think it's always in us. We are always our whole selves. It's like you said, what parts of yourself are you divorced from, or are
Yeah.
you just not acknowledging because of whatever reasons, right? Because you've been made to feel like you can't or you shouldn't or it's wrong. I think that I have had opportunities in my life to kind of reflect and be like, oh, this is totally an okay thing, that this is a process that I'm going through our whole lives. Unless you're dead, you're always growing, hopefully. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Always like
Yeah.
a different iteration of yourself from moment to moment to moment. And you get to choose like what path you're going to go down. Like we're always faced with choices. And it's like you can do you can go one way, you can go the other, you can decide to stay in the same place, but all of that's a choice. And what are the consequences of doing or not doing any of those things? And all of these characters in the book are in a spot where they get to make a choice about how they'd like to go forward. And if it's like if they turn away, like I'm thinking about Fred in The Loss of Heaven, the one who's,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I'm thinking about,
Oh, whew.
you have the option to it all throughout that story. He's kind of like trying to catch his reflection in different things, trying to see how other people see him,
Mm,
until that one moment where he actually sees himself as he is, stripped of all of his confidence and his arrogance, and then he chooses to turn away from it. And even that's a choice, and it's like what's coming for that character on the other side of that. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I
There's
got on a
definitely
tangent.
No, you didn't. It's that's the point. I mean, it's just it's a casual conversation. You know, it's yeah. The stuff about the religious pressures on women too. That is that also the loss of heart heaven? Is that
That one, I mean, it has that in there. I think all of them have elements, but if you're talking about the one that specifically, I think that's tongues with Zay in the church.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, and the stuff with Duck and
Yeah.
everything. Um, yeah, I wish I could find it. I thought I marked these better. I'm doing a terrible job with these. Um, we can also cut this out if we need to.
That's
um,
good. Then we can cut out
yeah, exactly. We
the
can cut out the air
debacle.
conditioning. We can cut out me searching for the quote. Um, but yeah, no, I was really struck by it. That's why I really want to find it.
I can tell you.
Where
We have
you talk about
page 33.
is it 33?
Yeah, 33 is where that story starts. You have the hardback, right?
I do.
Yeah.
The problem is I've marked it so many times that I have lost track of why I've marked what.
I do that all the time. I'm like, what are you marking this for if you're not gonna like give yourself enough to like go back to it?
I know, I know. Oh, right. So here we go. Her mother learned how to be a woman here in the faith, and her father a man. But Zay's been to the library and looked up real history, slave ships and witch trials and women kept in bare feet. The books she borrowed were full of words like pay gap and redline, and she noticed that in all genres, no matter literature or biography, men's fury stained the pages, sowing lies like white seeds inside of people's hearts. Pastor rises, squeezing around the clutter and perched on the desk, his feet resting on either side of Zay's. He leans down and places a heavy hand on her bare knee. We need good young girls, God-fearing girls like you, to be the backbone of our church. Do you understand? He asks, and his fingers flex. Oh, it's like it's so creepy, and I'm
Yeah.
not even looking at it. It's just and you there's so many sections in that story where you describe the expectations and you describe the way the pressures are sort of placed of like the way you are to behave if you are to be a good girl, you know? And I identify with that. I was raised to be a good girl, and I think I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out what that means and how to be a person with that being my default setting, you know? Is that something that you felt was sort of pushed as well with you, or is that what caused that feeling like of am I bad? Because I think when you're told all the time you have to be good, of course you wonder, are you bad,
Yeah.
right?
I think there's something there. I definitely, in certain ways, it was like how to be a good girl definitely pertained to like how to be a lady, how to be
Mm,
ladylike. You can't like, I was really like active. I wanted to climb trees. I wanted to go and catch frogs and be in the creek and do all that stuff. And my mom was like, you're acting like a little boy. You need to, this kind of stuff. But then my dad, on the one hand, raised me to be like super independent. Like he would be
mm,
like, you need to learn how to tell time. You're going to learn how to cook and you're going to learn how to, and that sounds like really domestic, but it really was kind of like, you need to know how to care for yourself.
yeah.
Um, and then later in life, he would, there was a little bit of weirdness where it would be like, oh, when you get married, you kind of have to like follow after your husband. I was like, Dad, we know me. Do we think that that's going to be like a thing? But yeah, I think that there are certain expectations about what it is to be a person, and that's very gendered, especially in this country, and in many countries. But like, I'm
Yeah.
just obviously I live in this one, so I'm just thinking about how
Yeah.
weird that was, and then especially for Black women and Black girls, it's like this
Yeah.
extra pressure of like, here are all of these societal norms you have to follow. Plus, hey, don't let the white people like think you're any worse than them, so you have to be extra, extra, kind of. So yeah, I think I'm unlearning a lot of like, I'm trying to figure out in the things that I want, what are the things I actually want for myself and what are the things I've been conditioned to want. It's like way harder
Yes.
to like disentangle those things than you'd think.
It's almost impossible. I can't believe how often I catch myself in things that I don't realize are just learned thoughts, you
Yeah.
know, and it's like and I spend a lot of my time trying to think for myself and diving into all of these things and being creative and whatever, but it's like you still can't untangle that from
Yeah.
where you were raised and the country you were raised in and the culture that you're consuming and all of those things. Are there are there publications or art or books that you feel like have been instrumental in your process, or is it more just sort of you're kind of collecting and collaging as you come across things?
I think it's both. I mean, no art happens in a vacuum as much as some artists would like you to believe that they just came to this on their own. It's like, we live in this world and everything is connected. And actually, us not believing that and not acting as if we're all connected is the reason why everything is so fractured and kind of falling
Mm,
apart. You can't do something over here without it affecting something over here. And I think that so yeah, so part of it is just being intensely curious and like nosy or whatever, and then the other part of it is like all of the art and artists that I've been um you know introduced to over years, stuff like even like films. Like I think about the Virgin Suicides before I even knew that that was a book. I didn't even know it was a
yep.
book at first. I came to it as a film, and then just like the mood of that was very much like I didn't know that you could think that way or tell other people that you thought that way, or you know what I mean, express like longing and melancholy and those types of ways that I often felt, but as a child was often told like, oh, you have no worries, like why, like you don't really feel that way. Even if I had like a headache when I was growing up, it used to be like, oh, you don't really have a headache, you're too young to have a headache, and I'm just like, okay. I
Like,
don't
but I
know.
do.
But yeah, so I mean, so many different films, and off the top of my head, I'm thinking in writing this book, it was really instrumental for me to read Julie Oranger. Oh my God, I can't, I'm blinking on the title right now, but Julie Oranger has a story collection that is so good and was like kind of going through all of these dark, How to Breathe Underwater. Oh my God, I'm glad it came to me.
Oh, nice.
Oh, it was so good. And then Antonia Nelson also, um, Female Trouble, obviously. Then there's Alice Walker, The Color Purple. There's Beloved. And really too, there's Janet Fitch's White Oleander.
Oh,
The
yeah.
book is like way better than the film, in my opinion.
Yes.
But
I'm with you. I agree.
yes, but yeah, just all of those things that made me understand, oh, other people feel this way. Because I think that's the thing that books and art is so good for, is like not feeling alone in your feelings, especially when so many feelings have been deemed like not good. And
Yep.
so you're not sure how to engage with those parts of yourself. So yeah.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. I totally agree. I feel like as a kid I was always dragging books around because they felt like my friends,
Yeah.
that I was like, these books get me. But
Yeah.
that was just because I was projecting myself into them. But
But it's
yeah, no,
nice to
I
have a space to do that, and you know what I mean? And that's what I hope for the book. I hope that it allows not just, going into these worlds that I've created for me essentially, right? For things that I'm curious about, but I hope that anybody who's reading it, there's a space in there for them to reflect on parts of their lives that they're like, "Oh, that's something that I hadn't thought about but have felt, or that's something that I didn't know was okay to feel or think about."
yeah. Did you have a sense at some point that you wanted people to walk away from the end of the collection with a certain feeling?
Hope, like you said, which is why it made me so like faith and hope, and like, yeah, like we can choose at any point to turn in the direction that we want, even if that direction doesn't make sense to somebody else, like someone
Yeah.
else that you love greatly, or really value their opinion. It's like only you get to live your life, only you have to live with the life that you've lived, right?
Yeah.
And anybody can make comments on that, but those comments happen for a split second, and then they're living their own life, you know what I mean? And even though it
Yeah.
feel like forever, especially the way that we've constructed our social medias and
I
things
know.
like that, it's like,
I know,
oh
I
no.
always say, like, other people are just other people. We're other people to someone else,
Right.
It's like, so what is an other person? Like, who am I to and I have to I say this with a grain of salt only because I know that I trip over it in my own life at times as well, but I try really hard to keep myself in that headspace of, like, who am I to care what someone else thinks? Really, what I have to worry about is, can I rest my head at night and feel like I did my best today and that I
Yeah.
gave what I could give today and that I'm proud of what I'm working toward. And anything beyond that, you don't know who is behind that comment on Twitter or Instagram or whatever,
Yeah.
or what day they had or how hard their day was. Or I remind myself even sometimes, like, sometimes a mean comment was the best way for that person to get through their day.
Yeah.
And I'm like, "You know what? That's all right."
Yeah.
Like, it's,
Exactly.
but it's a
It's good
tricky
to have
time.
that awareness and that compassion in one hand, and then in the other hand, be like, okay, so what are the boundaries I'm going to put up so I can do what I need to do without being so overly reliant on an outside perspective of myself. And I think that's
Yeah.
something that I've been working through my entire life. Um, for the many intersections of like what my identity is like
Mm,
I often first and foremost go and think like, oh, how am I being perceived versus how am I perceiving what I'm doing, or like, you know what I mean? And so
yeah.
it's been, a process still to kind of unlearn that external thing.
Yep.
uh yeah.
How do you approach teaching versus writing? Is that an interesting different adventure, or does it feel like it's integral to the writing process?
It's it's really funny because I spent most of my life being like, I would never teach. Like, just like in high school, I just remember I think I was in 11th grade and I was like looking at one of my teachers while they were, I don't know what they were doing, but I was just looking at them. I was like, why would you spend so many years in this school system and then decide to come back like on purpose? Like who would do that? I was like, I would never do that. And then I was like, oh, I want to write seriously. And one of the ways to do that was fully funded program, but you have to teach. And I was very like, oh, I had never taught. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be good at it. I don't know. And then I realized that like teaching, at least in this environment, is pretty much what I would do for free anyways. Like, oh, I get to come and talk about work, get to talk about
Right.
sentences, I get to talk about fiction and image, and those are things that I like to do. And so for me, the teaching was surprisingly like helpful to my craft because it's
Mm,
like, I mean, it's not a surprise when I look back at it. I was surprised that I would be so good at it, that I would feel really comfortable in the classroom that way. And then, yeah, really be able to connect and engage with my students, which I think is so important in any arts based practice, but especially writing, where you're trying to get at the heart of something outside of what our perceptions or, our facades are for what we feel like we have to be. So
yeah.
think it's really been good for me because if I can explain something to my students in a way, then it makes it more like clear for myself so I can do it with more intention in my own work.
Oh, that's really cool. That's really awesome. Ha ta Take me through, like, your experience with a sentence. Like, if you were in class with a student and they had, like, a sentence that you felt like had a good idea, but was sort of not clear and didn't kind of
Mm.
have a rhythm to it, and, how do you break that down? How do you approach that to go from the sort of rough draft of a sentence to, "This is a good
Do a
sentence"?
polished sentence. Yeah, so first and foremost, I make it clear to my students that I'm not the sole disseminator of knowledge in the classroom. Like, yes, there is a reason I am leading the classroom, but we are all here learning from each other. And it's literally the most valuable thing about workshop is hearing somebody's ideas about something and making you think about it in a different way. Like I can have my critiques and all of that stuff ready before I go to the classroom, but somebody could say something in the classroom that I didn't think about and it sparks a whole new thing for me like that. So on the one hand, I let them know that, and I think that it's really important for students to understand that first and foremost, they have to have their own vision clear in their head
Mm,
about what they want to do, their intentionality, before a community can be useful to that work. Because if you go to
wow.
any kind of space like that before you're ready, what will happen, or before you know what you're doing or what you're trying to move toward, it's so easy to let everybody else's ideas sway you or make you like, oh, I thought, okay, maybe I'll do this instead of that. He's like, you have to be really clear. So once you're really clear, anything that you hear will either resonate or not resonate. And then you can take what you need and then leave the rest. So I let them know that. I was like, everything that I'm saying to you is just a jumping off point. It's not something that you have to do. This is just from my perspective, because everybody can only tell you something from their own perspective, right? It's not a hard and
Yeah.
fast rule. Anybody who's telling you, oh, these are the rules of writing, side eye, because that's not true. It's so subjective. I would just, okay, I hear you, but I'm gonna, but so that's number one. And number two, sometimes it's easier for me to show them what I'm trying to do with a sentence rather than explain it because I'm so used to doing it in my process. So I've had to pull back a little bit because I'm like, you don't need to edit these students' work like you would edit your own work. They're not at that point usually at that time, but I kind of just show them. I'm like, okay, here's the sentence you wrote. If we just change this, if we maybe change this word or think about the rhythm here. Now this is the difference between the two sentences. I think sometimes like having an example of that is what I do for the sentence level. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but I often think that in those spaces though, because it's really easy too to get sucked into the sentence level stuff, making the
Right.
perfect sentence when the whole picture maybe needs some tweaking and stuff like that. So I kind of like,
Yeah.
let's zoom out really quick and just see where we're going. And once you have that big picture thing, then it's easier to go down to the minuscule and be like, okay, how's the
Yeah.
sentence working?
I feel like that takes some experience too. Like I think of that the way that would relate to my life is when I'm in an edit bay working on something that I've directed. It's like that the first pass is going to be just getting the big pieces in place. And then
Yeah,
it's not even worth getting into the minutia because you don't really know what it is till the big pieces are set. And then once the
exactly.
big pieces are set, new problems reveal themselves. And then there's always inevitably a point where you look at it and go, how did I not notice this problem before? And it's like, because the problem didn't exist until you solved all those other
Exactly.
problems,
You're moving something over here, something moves over here. And yeah, I agree with you, starting with the big picture, because if you work so much on a sentence, that sentence might not even exist in there because you've changed something here and now it doesn't make any sense. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, that's really cool. It's really fun to hear about what that process is like. And it's also really cool to hear that having that sense of community when you're leading a workshop like that is actually contributing to your own process.
Yeah.
I know you said you were working on another novel right now. Are you like in the edit process? I don't want to even get into like the story or anything as I want to let it be what it is, but
Yeah, thank you.
where are you in the process and like how are you feeling about that space?
Yeah, so this novel that I'm working on now was actually like the first thing that I was ever working on. It's the reason I went to the MFA. I thought it was going to be my first book. That was my intention because in the
Mm.
writing world, it's like you have to have a novel before you can do short stories. No one will even look at your short stories. And it was like, okay, well, the novel needs more time. But I am in the second draft of the novel, and
Okay.
it has taken me. I started. Okay, again, and I say this all the time just to go ahead and put that out there. I'm not trying to be precocious. I did write a version of this when I was 12. It did not
Oh
look
my
like what it
God.
looked like, and I still have it. I was just finding the pages and I was like, oh, this is horrible. This is so terrible. But I started trying to rewrite this thing that I had made as a child in 2010. And I'm still working on it now in 2022, and I'm on the second draft. But I think so much of it has been like, I have grown and evolved so much as a person and as a writer, and just having more experiences, that it's taken that long for me to figure out like what the story actually is versus what I thought it was like when I was however old. Even when I was in my 20s,
Yeah.
it's different. And so I'm working on it, and so now it's going to be even more interesting. I haven't really worked on it all summer because of all of the things that happened this year. But so the story is about, and this is just like a quick, I'm not even saying it's basically a mother and a daughter, and the mother dies in the story. And so,
Oh
so
God.
yeah, and so this was a thing I was already working on for years and
Ugh.
years and years. And so now this thing has happened in my life, and it's kind of like, I mean, I'm just interested to see how different it's going to be now that I have actually experienced my mother's death. You know what I mean? And so it's kind of
Yeah.
like, I'm interested to see how that's going to change the process of it. But it also, I don't want to say weirdly, because this is one of the things that makes people feel like it's not okay to feel how they feel. But like, I'm also kind of really interested and excited to see how the work is going to change now that I know what any of this kind of grief feels like. Cause I was doing it, but I had no pinpoint, just like I'm not a mother, right? But I can, do that kind of stuff. I was still doing it. But now that I do have like connection with that, I'm wondering how it's going to change the work. Um,
Yeah, I'm fascinated to be able to I'm excited to read it whenever it
yeah.
is in the world because um you seem to have such a empath existence, like you feel what all these people have felt that you maybe haven't walked through yourself yet, but yet you're feeling it with such detail and nuance. So I will be fascinated to see how that even shifts once
Yeah.
you're writing from the experience of it. Not that I would ever wish that experience on someone, but
Right, but
um
it happens, and that's another part. I think our culture is not really good at handling death. There's
mm-mm.
like, and there's no manual for it, and there can't be because everybody's grief is individual. But that's part of what I was writing in that book, is that like everybody's grief, everybody's existence, though connected, is so individual, and you can't say like, oh, you have to stop grieving at this certain time or only in these ways. And I think that's a problem with how we view human emotion. They're not
Yeah,
projections of the mind, they're physical things that you can feel in your body. And they're also a kind of intelligence. They're trying to tell you something about how you're experiencing your environment or where you are in a certain moment in time. So, yeah, I think
it's
mostly I'm like, okay, this thing happened. It happens. It would have happened eventually. It will always happen.
Yeah.
And so, like, what am I now going to do with this existence? You know what I mean? And my
And
own,
also you get to keep her alive in the
yeah,
memory of all of that, I mean,
yeah,
that's also such a, um, I guess the more beautiful side of the cycle, which is that, the way that you write and the stories that you tell and all of the emotion that you pour into things, it all keeps her alive in a certain way. I think about my grandparents who passed as well. My mom and I talk about this all the time. I always think of them as still here. I know I don't physically see them, but I can't quite grasp that they're not here. I still think about like, oh, it'd be cool if they knew this, or, I think about exchanges that we had that impacted me, or in big moments, they sort of still feel present. And, we'll never know until we're on the other side what there
yeah.
really is. But it is kind of a beautiful way to feel like she lives through your words.
Yeah, and I feel that. Also, my mom was a big reader writer. Like, that's the reason why I'm a big reader writer. So, um, yeah, I feel like she's here. And if you think of like believing in just like energy can be neither created nor destroyed, if we're energy in certain ways, right? You can feel it like if somebody walks into the room and they're in a bad mood or in a good mood and it's catching, you know what I mean? So like then it's not gone, it's just transformed. So
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, we have our an obsession with water in common. I
Very.
was realizing as I was reading, I was like, and I've also seen interviews where you've talked about like the power of water. I was like, oh my gosh, I've talked about this so much. There was a stretch of my early 20s where I was doing a lot of searching and trying to figure out if I was going to believe in religion or what I was going to do. I felt like this big energy, but I wasn't sure what I believed in. So I would go and I would take my like little folding chair and umbrella and sit on the beach in the ocean every Sunday, and I would like read the Bible and I would read the paper, and I was just trying to like devour everything I could devour to try to figure out like what I believed. And I remember that feeling of like the water sort of sucking, it kind of the tide would come up and then you'd feel it like suck at your feet. And I was like, oh, whoa, this cycle of energy is so
Yeah.
profound. And also, this beautiful ocean that's so great to look at could kill me
Could
if I
kill
got
you.
in it.
It's so
I was
dangerous. Yes, I think
like,
about that all the time.
and that I think that is a great way to sort of explain to someone who hasn't read your writing yet the duality that you're able to really wrangle in your words, because um there is this beauty and this hope and this life affirming spirit, and yet there is this violence and there is a darkness and there is like an undertow that wants to pull at that at all times, and that tug creates such a beautiful friction, which feels very in line with oh my gosh, what's the word that you explore in that story that has three meanings? The lascivious,
Oh yeah, Luciferus. Yeah,
luciferous. That's
yeah,
right. Yes,
yeah, yeah,
where you explain the three dictionary, the definitions, and one is sort of like an angel fall, like Lucifer, angel fallen from
yeah.
heaven into hell, and then but the last explanation is a match for
A
friction.
matchbook of friction. Yeah,
Ooh,
yeah.
yes, it's so powerful. It's so
Honestly, that
cool.
was one that actually came to me as a word of the day. I have a dictionary on my phone so that I can pronounce words and look up words I don't know immediately. And so, like, it just happened to be, it was like luciferous. And I had never heard of that word. And I was like, wait,
Me
what?
neither.
And so that story became that because of that. I think I already had some kind of thing, some idea about protection and ways that we for example, right, this story collection is talking about morality and like how it's really subjective. Like what Zay does in that story, you wouldn't ever be like, yes, I'm glad you did that, thumbs up. But
Yeah.
in that moment for her, that was her protecting her brother in the only
Yep.
way that she could. And so
Yep.
for her it made sense and it was a good thing, right? And so
Right.
I already had that kind of piece. And then when I saw this definition, it was like, boom, I was like, all these things go together. And like
Oh,
that's what happened. Yeah.
it's so cool. But I think it's really defining of yeah, what you're accomplishing on the page for the reader. Which I really appreciate. I mean, I really, really enjoy it. And my only thing is I wish there were like 10 of your books already on my bookshelf to read. Uh,
It's so slow. It's such slow work. I mean, sometimes, right? It's like more often than not, I'm mostly having to get over the resistance to writing than the actual writing taking so long. And I think the resistances are are like fears, things that
Mhm.
I've internalized that are actually external to me, right? I'm already
Oh,
thinking
interesting.
about how are people going to perceive what I'm writing? Like for example, that moment I'm talking about in that story with Zay, I almost had a moment, not almost, I had a moment where I was like, can I write this? Is this too much? I'm gonna get canceled. You can't say this. And then I was like, well, you're thinking it, it came up. So like, why not?
Yeah. I also think that there's a power to the short story with ideas like that as well. And I could be wrong. This is just a theory of mine. And I think about this even in like short film versus full
Mm,
length film, where it's like there is a space that you can explore theme and you can explore morality and you can explore boundaries a little bit differently. You can kind of like shoulder your way out of it a little, push the boundaries a little bit more when you're in short form sometimes, just because you're not I guess you're not held accountable to continue on past that point, right? Like
mhm.
you get to sort of like push that idea and really like push that theme out. And I don't know, I don't really know why it is that there seems to be a little bit more liberty there, but I feel that I judge short films often, and I'm always intrigued and so drawn in by the subject matter because it's always it's richer, like
Mhm.
it's more and it's thick and it's more indulgent, almost like in a good way. I don't
Right.
some people like to turn indulgent into a bad to mean something negative, and I mean it in like the most positive way, where it's like you just lean all the way into an
Like going
idea.
all the way in. Yeah, I mean, and
Yeah,
you have to do that when you have to make a slice of something representative of the whole, right? And so
yeah,
and that's kind of how I hope my stories are operating. I hope that when people get to the end of them, they're still thinking about those characters and what they're doing next. You know what I mean? Instead of thinking like, oh, okay, that's it, which is, why my endings tend to be the way that they are. I think of them like, they're windows rather than exits.
yeah,
We can
your
look
endings are
through it.
beginnings.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you can look through it and see.
challenging people to decide what happens next,
Exactly.
which is brave. I mean, it's a brave thing to do because you're like releasing those characters to have a million
Yeah.
identities.
And some people hate that, but I think that
I love it.
I think that that resistance has to do with the same thing that we want in our life. Like, we're in terms of people being resistant sometimes to the stories, like, oh, they're really dark. And it's like, yeah, but like, what are you resisting knowing about the world or yourself if you're trying, not acknowledging these things? And it's also kind of like, you can't just tie everything up in a neat little bow and be like, this is what happened. And now everything is like, life's not like that. And I'm not saying
Yeah.
all art has to be like life, but for these stories, for me, it felt right to be like,
Yeah.
yeah.
How do you manage because I totally identify with the resistance, like I'm sure every artist in some level has that sort of like friction in themselves of like, ugh, what do you do to push yourself past that feeling when you know you just have to put pen to page?
Yeah. In the past, and I guess now coming up shortly, because I'm gonna be doing the same thing, I basically have to sit with myself and be like, what are you actually afraid of? Like, what is the thing that's keeping you from writing? Then I identify that thing, then I acknowledge it, then I'm like, okay, all right, but this is still the way I feel like I'm here to make stories, to do these kinds of things. So are you going to let this thing stop you from doing it? And then usually what I do, because mostly what I have a resistance to is I'm a little bit of a perfectionist.
Mhm.
So I will have it like I'm like, oh, it's so perfect up here, and what if I can't get it on the page the way it is up here? And you can only ever get close, right? Sometimes, and sometimes you can get really, really close, but
Yeah.
that's the thing. And so I'll just start. It's like having nothing there. The blank page is really like, and then it's just like, okay, just write a terrible sentence. Because guess what? Revision exists and you know how
Yep.
to do it. And that's, you can't make something from nothing. So
Yep.
make an ugly
Yeah.
sentence, make a terrible sentence, and then you can make it better later. But you got to get started.
You
So
got
it's
to get
most,
the clump of clay out, right?
yeah, it's just like, go do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that actually is a great lead into my last question that I always ask, which is what's the best advice anyone's ever given you? And it doesn't have to be about writing, just in general.
I feel like I've had so much good advice, but because I've been getting a lot of advice in the last few months because of all of the big,
All the
things
big things
that
happening.
happen, all the big things happening. I think what I said earlier is something that I've been like really stuck in my head where it's like, you're the only person who can live your life. And
Mm,
and that sounds like so just general and simple, but really it's like, oh, I'm the only person that can live it. And you hear like two different sayings all the time about life. You say, "Oh, life is short," but then you also hear like life is long. You know what I mean? And
Yep.
I think it's both at once, and you never know when that path is going to be over. So I was just thinking like, okay, in the time that I have, especially because my mother was 51. She was just before her 52nd birthday, so super duper young.
Oh,
I just think about like how I used to think like 30 was so old, and now I'm 33, and I'm like, it's not that old actually. I mean, like my ankles snap a little bit more, but like it's not that old. And then I was thinking about 51, and I was like, dang, that's actually really young too. And so I was just thinking, what do I want to do in this time that I have? So, like, only you can live your life. So, even if something that you're doing, something that you want to pursue, doesn't look like valuable to anybody else, you have to decide for yourself what, like, do I actually want to do it though and still do it, even if nobody else understands it. Um,
yep.
so yeah, I
I
think
love
right
that.
now that's what I'm holding to.
Well, thank you so much for hanging out with us and answering all my questions. And I'm so excited to read the next book. And I will be rereading this over the years. It's going to go in my rotation. So thank you so much. Truly, it's really beautiful. And hopefully, as we are putting out quotes and kind of putting it out in the world, that even more and more people will be able to experience it alongside everyone else who's already enjoying it.